Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating, the true origins of modern Indian nationalism. It's an incredible story, full of unintended consequences, massive cultural shifts, and a nationwide awakening that literally changed the course of history forever.
Right off the bat, I want you to think about this historical paradox. How does an empire accidentally forge the exact nation that ultimately defeats it? It's wild, right? But British rule in India didn't just suppress a population. By trying to lock down their control, they inadvertently built the infrastructure, created the conditions, and gave people the shared grievances necessary to completely dismantle that very same empire.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the colonial paradox, forging political and economic unity, the intellectual and cultural awakening, global sparks and local anger, early political associations, and finally, setting the national stage.
Section 1. The colonial paradox, stimulus and reaction. We kind of tend to think of nationalism as this sudden, spontaneous idea, but it was actually a highly complex mix of things.
You see, modern nationalism really grew from people recognizing some glaring contradictions. Across the entire subcontinent, folks were waking up to a hard truth, that colonial rule was the primary reason for India's economic backwardsness. And what's amazing here is how this realization bridged massive social gaps. I'm talking peasants, artisans, factory workers, intellectuals, and even wealthy capitalists. All these totally diverse classes realized their everyday economic struggles were tied directly to colonial exploitation. Suddenly, they had a common enemy.
Moving to Section 2, forging political and economic unity, the crucible. We have this vast, incredibly diverse subcontinent, and ironically, it was the British administration that unified it. Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer irony of the situation. Look at the British intentions: military defense, extracting resources, and commercial exploitation. They just wanted total control and profit. But their actions had these crazy, unintended nationalist outcomes. They accidentally linked regional economies. If a crop failed in one region, it suddenly affected prices in another. Plus, they physically connected political leaders from totally different regions, meaning those leaders could finally meet up, swap ideas, and organize.
So how did they accidentally build this crucible? Well, the British laid down this massive administrative grid. They set up a unified judiciary, codified civil and criminal laws, and built a professional civil service. But the real game changers were the railways, the telegraph, and the new road networks. The British built these for their own administrative convenience, for sure, but in doing so, they literally wired the country together, binding the fate of the Indian people like never before.
All right, Section 3, intellectual and cultural awakening. Because once that structural grid was in place, revolutionary ideas could travel fast.
The introduction of a modern education system was a total game changer. The British pushed English education because, frankly, they needed an army of clerks to run their administration. But, and here's the twist, Indians took that language and used it as a tool to talk to each other across totally different linguistic borders. They started absorbing radical Western concepts of democracy and secularism. They were reading folks like Milton, Shelley, Mill, Rousseau, and Voltaire. They're looking at how modern free countries operated and then looking around at their own total lack of basic rights.
And these ideas definitely didn't stay stuck in the classroom. In the second half of the 19th century, the Indian press absolutely exploded. Despite strict colonial censorship and all sorts of restrictions, by 1877, there were roughly 169 vernacular newspapers reaching about 100,000 people. To put that into perspective, that level of reach back then was massive. It became this revolutionary tool for spreading modern ideas of self-government and civil rights directly to the masses.
At the exact same time, you had this incredible rediscovery of India's past. Historical research done by both European and Indian scholars started painting a totally new picture. It completely demolished these old colonial myths that Indians just had a history of servility. Instead, they uncovered this incredibly rich heritage, thriving ancient trade, beautiful arts, and highly developed political institutions. The psychological boost this gave the new generation? Absolutely immense. It gave them the self-respect and confidence they needed to challenge foreign rule.
Which brings us to this fantastic observation by historian Percival Spear. He noted, "The new middle class was a well-integrated all-India class, a dynamic minority. It had a sense of unity of purpose and of hope." So the crucial takeaway here is that this brand new English-educated urban intelligentsia became the absolute nucleus of political leadership. They had the education, they understood the ruling class, and they stepped right up to lead the growing unrest.
Section 4, Global Sparks and Local Anger, the Catalyst. We've talked about the slow burn of unification, But what actually lit the fuse?
Well, Indian nationalists were definitely looking around the globe. The world was shifting, and they were paying close attention. They watched new nations rise up from the ruins of the Spanish and Portuguese empires in South America. They drew huge inspiration from liberation movements in Greece and Italy, and they watched the struggle in Ireland very closely. They realized that if united people in other parts of the world could take down mighty empires, well, there was no reason Indians couldn't do the exact same thing.
But nothing sparks a fire quite like pure arrogance. Local anger was heavily fueled by reactionary policies and undeniable racial superiority from rulers like Lytton and Curzon. A massive turning point was the Ilbert Bill controversy. When Europeans organized massive protests just to protect their own racial privileges, it proved to Indians, once and for all, that they were never going to get justice or fair play from colonial rulers. This blatant arrogance acted as the final spark, and ironically, it taught Indians how to effectively organize and agitate. Talk about a backfire.
Which brings us to Section 5, Early Political Associations. All this awakening finally started turning into concrete action.
Let's trace this timeline real quick. Now, early 19th century groups were pretty regional, often led by wealthy aristocrats like the Bangabasha Prakasika Sabha over in Bengal in 1836. But as we move toward 1876, a younger, much more dynamic intelligentsia takes the reins. You get groups like the Indian Association of Calcutta, founded by younger nationalists like Surendranath Banerjee. And this was happening everywhere. You had the Bombay Presidency Association and the Madras Mahajana Sabha, all building a unified political voice across the map.
Now, you might be wondering, what were these early pre-Congress groups actually demanding? Mostly, they pushed for administrative reforms, the Indianization of government services, better funding for education, and general political advancement. Now, yes, they relied heavily on petitions and polite requests at first, but we definitely shouldn't discount them. They did the heavy lifting, laying the vital groundwork, waking up the public consciousness, and educating people on their political rights.
Finally, Section 6, Setting the National Stage. Let's see how all these puzzle pieces finally click together. We really have to remember that cultural reform at home was just as important as fighting the British. Progressive socio-religious reform movements were working tirelessly to root out old social evils that had kept Indian society divided for centuries. By tackling these internal divisions head-on, they actively brought different sections of society together. They effectively created the perfect, unified climate for national modernization to take root.
So let's look at the whole shebang. What did this historical crucible actually yield? We ended up with a connected economy bridging vast regional gaps, a shared English language that let leaders coordinate, a highly empowered intelligentsia armed with Western democratic ideals, and a renewed pride in India's past, common grievances that bound the poorest peasant to the richest capitalist, and the organizational blueprints laid out by those early political groups. The colonial machine had quite literally printed the exact blueprint for Indian liberation.
So I'll leave you with this powerful thought to chew on. If the very structures built for absolute imperial control, the railways, the laws, the language, the education, became the exact weapons of the empire's undoing, can any system of oppression ever truly prevent its own collapse? It is the ultimate historical paradox, and honestly, a brilliant testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world today.